Rutherford Hayes had much in common with the previous president, the 18th President, Ulysses Grant. They were both born in 1822 in the state of Ohio. Both fought also in the Civil War and ended up as president. However, the two men took very different paths to that office. Whereas Grant was primarily a soldier, Hayes was a lawyer who, like thousands of others, got caught up in the Civil War. He entered Kenyon College at the age of 16, and 5 years later he was a brilliant student at Harvard, where he took a law degree with honours. At the age of 25 he moved to the city of Cincinnati, where he set up a thriving legal business as a defence lawyer, often representing murderers and escaped slaves. By 1852 he married Lucy Webb. They had 3 sons. Hayes continued to build his legal practice throughout the 1850s and became acquainted with senior members of the newly emerging Republican Party. By 1858 he had become the city solicitor in Cincinnati, but lost this position a couple of years later due to the Democratic Party becoming a strong force in the city. Hayes joined the volunteers in Ohio after the Civil War began and was quickly promoted to Major of the 23rd Regiment. By September 1861 he had clashed with Confederates in the present-day West Virginia, and by November he was promoted to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. In September 1862 he was involved in the Second Battle of Bull Run and also confronted the Confederates as part of the Maryland Campaign. Hundreds of men lost their lives in these battles. Hayes was shot in the arm but bravely fought on. He believed in the struggle. As a lawyer in the late 50s he had acquired deep personal knowledge of the suffering caused by slavery and used this knowledge to win many courtroom battles. On the battlefield he also brought similar conviction and dedication to the cause. Following the Union victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg in July 1863, Hayes persuaded many soldiers to re-enlist and continue the fight in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia in late 63 and 64. Hayes was shot a second time in July 1864. This time he was shot in the shoulder. He's quite badly injured, actually. He impressed his commanders with his bravery and was promoted to the rank of Brigadier General in October 1864, and later he became a Major General. While fighting in the Shenandoah Valley in mid-1864, Republicans in his home state of Ohio nominated him to run for the House of Representatives, and although he didn't campaign, he was elected in late 1864. As a Republican, he was disappointed with the President Andrew Jackson, who wanted to readmit many of the southern states without essential reforms taking place. In 1867, he resigned from Congress and was elected Governor of Ohio. He helped to promote the 15th Amendment in that state, which gave voting rights to people of colour. In July 1876, he defeated the favourite James G. Blaine at the Republican Convention for President. In the presidential election of 1876, Hayes faced New York Governor Samuel J. Tilden in the November election. There was ongoing tension in this election in regard to black people's right to vote, especially in the South. Tilden actually did very well. He won the popular vote and initially appeared to have won the election, the Electoral College vote as well. He got 184 votes, just one short of the majority needed to Hayes's 165. However, there was 20 Electoral College votes in dispute from 3 states and 1 vote from the Oregon country. Hayes needed all 20 to win. A dispute went on about these votes for months. Eventually, Grant and Congress agreed to set up an electoral commission to decide the issue. The commission was dominated by Republicans, who awarded all 20 Electoral College votes to Hayes, thereby making him president by a single vote, 185. Naturally, Democrats were outraged with the result and detested Hayes as president. The presidency, therefore, of Rutherford Hayes got off to a very poor start. Republicans agreed to withdraw all federal troops from the South as part of a compromise deal with the Democrats. The Democrats also controlled the House of Representatives, and the South reverted to a form of home rule. The Enforcement Acts to suppress the Ku Klux Klan, which were brought in during Grant's presidency to protect people of colour, were now repealed by a Congress controlled by Democrats. Hayes pleaded for protection for people of colour, but to little effect, as Democrats regarded him as a fraudulent president from the beginning. With the Enforcement Acts repealed, new forms of intimidation and violence took place in the South, particularly in North and South Carolina, where a new organisation, the Red Shirts, replaced the Ku Klux Klan. Congress refused to finance federal marshals to supervise voting in the South, and most black people were too scared to vote because of the violence and intimidation. In fact, the era of Reconstruction, equality and justice all came to an end during the presidency of Rutherford Hayes. As President, Hayes also attempted to reform the civil service. Major political appointments known as the spoil system went all the way back to the Jackson presidency of the 1830s. Office holders were often politically active and were also expected to make contributions, financial contributions to congressmen. Such a system basically created a lot of inefficiency and wastage, and Hayes was determined to put a stop to it. He set up a special cabinet committee headed by Secretary of State William T. Evarts and Interior Secretary Carl Schutz. However, such reforms were strongly resisted by Republican leaders in Congress such as Ross O'Conklin, who led a Republican faction in Congress known as the Stalwarts. Hayes issued an executive order which forbade federal office holders being required to make political contributions. He also sacked the collector of the New York port, Chester C. Arthur. The New York port collector job was an extremely important job as it constituted a major portion of the federal government's revenue. Hayes, as president, also battled hard against corruption and inefficiency in other major government offices and laid the basis of the Pendleton Act of 1883, which modernised the United States Civil Service and based recruitment into the service on merit rather than on political connections. In relation to the economy, Hayes aimed to continue the hard money policy started by Ulysses Grant in the Coinage Act of 73. This meant replacing greenback dollars with a gold-backed currency. However, this was strongly resisted, particularly in the West, where farm prices dropped as the currency supply contracted. Wages of workers were also decreased, which caused strikes in many major towns and cities. Eventually, a compromise solution was reached in the Bland-Allison Act of 1878. This act allowed for some expansion of the currency based on silver and gold. Hayes vetoed this act but was overruled by Congress. The act basically helped to created a bimetallism system whereby both gold and silver supported the dollar. The expansion of the currency through silver was supported by interests such as the mining interests, farmers and people with huge borrowings. The Bland-Allison Act made silver about 90% as valuable as gold and was known for the period as the silver standard. It expanded the currency and eased the deflationary cycle. Workers at this time worked a 12-hour day in factories and farms and railway companies, so wages decreases caused huge, intense anger among workers. In fact, in 1877, the first year of Hayes' presidency, several railway companies went out of business as the economic recession of previous years got worse. Remaining companies cut wages several times in an attempt to survive. In July 1877, just a few months after Hayes got into office, railway workers in Baltimore, New York, and in his own state of Ohio walked off the job, and this began a huge railway strike which spread to other states and other cities. Both federal troops and state militia confronted workers as riots broke out and Pittsburgh station was set on fire. There was violence in several cities. The riots and violence spread to Chicago, St. Louis and other smaller stations. State militia killed a number of workers and rioters as the violence intensified. Eventually, workers were forced to return to work for a lower wage. However, the president was unhappy with this solution, as he noted later in his diary. In regard to foreign policy, Hayes used the Monroe Doctrine as his guiding principle in his policy in Latin America. In the 1870s, Argentina and Paraguay were in dispute in regard to a territory known as Gran Chaco. The president got involved and awarded the territory to Paraguay, which today constitutes about 60% of that country. During the Hayes presidency also there was numerous cross-border raids from Mexican bandits. At first, Hayes threatened to invade Mexico in search of the bandits. However, after some time, a more diplomatic solution was found when he met President Porfirio Diaz, and both leaders agreed to sit down and to basically pursue bandits in their own country and return them to the other country. In 1868, the Burlingame Treaty allowed for the unrestricted flow of Chinese into the United States. However, 5 years later, with the onset of recession and people losing their jobs, Chinese were blamed for depressing wages, and this led to strong anti-Chinese riots. Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1879, which Hayes vetoed as he wished to honour an international treaty of a few years earlier, about 10 years earlier. Compromise solution was found here as well, whereby Chinese immigrants to the United States was reduced. In relation to Native Americans, the Hayes administration continued to attempt to assimilate Indians into American society. However, the Interior Secretary, Carl Schutz, took over Indian affairs and introduced a new policy of selling land in small allotments to Indian families. Many Indians, unskilled in farming, failed to realise the value of the land, sold it to white speculators, and ended up worse off than ever. At the end of his presidency in 1881, the population of America was 50 million. No new states joined the Union. The total remained at 38 states. The United States had by now become largely recovered from the Civil War and was emerging as one of the most powerful nations in the world. Hayes began his career as a defence lawyer, abolitionist and radical Republican reformer. However, he became a moderate as his career progressed and eventually became the 19th president between 1877 and 1881. The Hayes presidency marked the end of Reconstruction as the federal government failed to bring racial equality to the South. His presidency was also weakened from the start, whereby he done a deal with the Democrats to remove the military from the South, thereby undermining the rights of people of colour. Democrats also controlled the House of Representatives, and new laws in the South based on segregation meant that people of colour were treated as second-class citizens for several decades. Hayes died in 1893, 12 years after he left the presidency.